Welcome to the Global News Podcast. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and I'm joined from Washington by our reporter there, Bernd de Busman. Bernd, an agreement has been signed between Iran and the US to end their war. Remind us what the main points of this agreement are.
Well, there are 14 separate points in the agreement. I think the main things are that, A, there's a 60-day pause on any sort of fighting or military action. That's made very clear in one of the initial points. There's also the promise of further discussions on Iran's nuclear program. There's very few specifics in the actual document that's been signed, but essentially the two sides will get together as soon as late this week to discuss what that actually looks like. There is a minimum standard for what happens with Iran's highly enriched uranium, which is President Trump's overarching goal in this, that it be diluted in place. But that's a very technical discussion that will have to be ironed out over a much longer time frame. In the Obama administration, for example, took 20 months to discuss the accelerated, Iran's nuclear program, rather. So it's a very accelerated timeline to discuss that. Of course, the Strait of Hormuz will now be opened, and the blockade of Iranian ports will now be lifted, but it is a performance-based agreement. So if Iran complies with its part of the agreement, it begins reaping more benefits of the blockade being lifted, for example. And I think one of the most crucial things, and this is something that's been very important to the Iranian side, is there's mention of a $300 billion reconstruction fund. Now, we still don't know what exactly that fund looks like. The U.S. and President Trump have been very clear that that money won't come directly from the U.S., but it does open the possibility that Gulf countries, the UAE, for example, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, could contribute to some sort of reconstruction for the damage that Iran suffered during Operation Epic Fury. I think those are the three main bullet points of that 14-point agreement.
And of course, what everyone wants to know, Bernd, is, who got the better end of the deal?
Well, both sides, I think, are already claiming victory. Now, President Trump has said his main goal with this whole campaign and the subsequent negotiations has been that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. Now, that's written in the deal. Of course, as I mentioned, that's a very technical discussion that we don't actually have the details of what that looks like. And President Trump also is claiming victory because the Strait of Hormuz is now open. Now, that's a much more controversial point here domestically in the U.S. because the Strait of Hormuz was open before Donald Trump and Israel began striking Iran on February 28th. On the Iranian side, it keeps their government intact. There's a pledge that the U.S. won't involve itself in Iranian domestic matters, which, of course, that will be greatly disappointing to Iranian dissidents or those people that believe that President Trump would come help them protest against the regime, for example. And there's no mention of Iran's ballistic missile program, for example. So that remains a capability that can be intact in the future. I think both sides will claim victories by that same logic, though. On both sides, there's people that think this agreement wasn't enough. In the U.S., it's been quite controversial. People thought the war shouldn't have started. Many people thought the war shouldn't have started in the first place. Others think this agreement didn't really address the core issues. And in Iran, hardliners are uncomfortable with what they see as too many concessions being made to the U.S.
But as you said, there's been criticism, especially where you are, and from Democrats, and crucially, also from Republicans, President Trump's own party.
That's true. I mean, Democrats have been largely against this war from the beginning, so I think it's no surprise that they've been very critical. There had already been an agreement on Iran's nuclear program in place since the Obama administration. It's known as the JCPOA. And the logic from Democrats has been that if President Trump didn't see that agreement as fit, he could have adjusted it rather than essentially what he did in his first term was tear it up and then return to war. Now, other Republicans think that that the agreement doesn't go far enough, that it does nothing really to guarantee Israel's security, for one, that it does nothing to stop Iran's support of proxy militias such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen, and that essentially now the U.S. is reconstructing what it just spent considerable amounts of money and 13 dead American servicemen to deconstruct. So there's quite a lot of consternation, and several, including people who are very close to President Trump, usually Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, for example, they've been very critical. And one Republican senator, outgoing Senator Bill Cassidy, called this the greatest foreign policy blunder in generations. So I think he'll certainly be coming under some criticism from Iran hawks in his own party. And there are people of his own party who didn't think this war was a very good idea to begin with, given that President Trump had promised no foreign entanglements when he ran for office.
Well, you mentioned Israel. There's a very strong Israeli lobby in the US, isn't there? And we understand that Israel wants to remain in Lebanon, where it's fighting against Hezbollah, even though this agreement should encompass Israel as well, and the war should stop on all sides.
And President Trump, over time, has become increasingly aware that Lebanon, perhaps more than any other issue, is what threatens to upend this deal. Over the last few weeks, we've seen him be increasingly publicly vocal about his displeasure with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over continued strikes in Lebanon. And really, that's been kind of the strongest language we've heard from this president, who has otherwise really been a steadfast ally of Israel's. He believes that while Israel has a right to defend itself, he's called into question the methods in which it claims to defend itself, the striking of residential buildings in Lebanon, for example. So I think he'll be leaning on Prime Minister Netanyahu quite hard. Of course, that puts the Prime Minister in a very awkward position at home. He is facing an electoral battle. There are people who in Israel who think that this deal isn't something that Israel should abide by. And at the same time, Netanyahu has kind of framed himself as being a security-focused prime minister. So any damage in the relationship with the U.S., Israel's main security benefactor, it's the greatest recipient of U.S. military aid anywhere in the world, also complicates that for him. So I think we'll be hearing quite a lot about that from people who feel strongly about Israel here in Washington, particularly on Capitol Hill, many of whom have already started calling into question why, in their belief, Israel isn't more protected by the conclusion of this deal.
And what about this $300 billion aid package that's going to go to Iran? I mean, what's the view of that in the US?
Well, that's a particularly interesting one because President Trump's main gripe with the JCPOA under President Obama was that funds were given to Iran for compliance. Now, to make those things be kind of more in contrast, President Trump, Vice President Vance, and other U.S. officials have said that none of that money will actually be coming from the U.S. That could come from Gulf allies. The UAE, for example, was given an example by White House officials yesterday. If they chose to invest money in Iran's reconstruction, the U.S. wouldn't stand in the way. And other bits of that money are already Iranian money that's been frozen in foreign banks, and that'll now be released to Iran if they comply with their part of the agreement. At the same time, I think Iran hawks in particular are very nervous about Iran being given an economic lifeline at a time when it was quite struggling because of the blockade on its ports and being cut off from the world financial system. Now money, hundreds of millions of dollars, will start being released to Iran over the next 60 days as these negotiations continue, which helps the Iranian government find its feet again after what was essentially a very difficult period. But the Trump administration is very much framing as it's not our money and we're not giving it to them, to the American people.
And what's your sense, Bernd, of how this is all going down with Americans themselves, with the average American voter? Are they happy just to see an end of this war?
Well, I think in part, yes. This war was never particularly popular to begin with, and in that it's been very different than previous U.S. wars that began with widespread popularity, the war in Iraq, for example, and became less popular over time. Polls showed that this one was never very popular to begin with, and it became less popular as Americans went to the petrol pump and found themselves paying more money. I think when those prices start to come down, and we've already seen them start to come down, Americans will feel very much relieved that this conflict is over. Of course, that doesn't address the core question that many of them had, is why this conflict began in the first place, and really what has the U.S. gained. I think Democrats in particular will point to those falling petrol prices and say that they were elevated because this conflict began. So many Americans, I think, will be very relieved that this conflict is over, but there's still quite a lot of misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about why this war began and what exactly the U.S. achieved over the course of this conflict.
And Bernd, how precarious do you think this is? Because we're now entering a 60-day ahead of us, aren't we, where all this has got to be finalised if it's to stay in place?
Well, I think at the moment, at least, all signs indicate that neither side really has the appetite to return to full-scale military conflict. Even in recent weeks, when we saw the U.S. and Iran trade fire at several points, it was quite clear that the U.S. nor the Iranians wanted to return to conflict. At the same time, things are quite precarious. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has said that if Iran doesn't comply with the various points set out in the memorandum, the U.S. is fully prepared to reinstall the blockade on Iranian ports. And if that happens, one can imagine a situation in which tensions skyrocket again across the Gulf, or that Iran might therefore take action to cut off the Strait of Hormuz again. There's also the question of Lebanon. Even after the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, we saw Israeli strikes in Lebanon. And I think one of the ultimate tests of this agreement will see how much Israel continues those operations despite U.S. pressure, and how much patience Iran has for those Israeli strikes in Lebanon, which they've made very clear they see as subject to part of this deal, even if the Israelis don't think so.
Thanks, Bernd. Bernd de Busman there in Washington, our White House reporter. If you want more on this story, just listen to the Global News podcast. Click on the link below. But that's it from this edition of the Global News podcast here on YouTube. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and bye for now.